One of the biggest mistakes I see with messaging is that people confuse messaging for copy or messaging for content. But it's not either of those. It's an ecosystem. What the heck do I mean? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about inside of this episode. So if you're curious, keep on listening. Hi, I'm Brandon Lucero, and you're about to experience the new way to thrive in business, entrepreneurship, and life by leaning into who you are, what you love, and standing up for what you want to create. Get ready, because this is where we go against the grain, say no to outdated society norms, and we say yes to change in order to create a happier, more fulfilled world. Welcome to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. Hello. Welcome to another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. This episode, we're getting back to my roots. We're talking about messaging, but we're going to talk about something that I don't think I've talked about on the podcast. Maybe I have. I don't know. I'm losing track by this point. But we're going to talk about three powerful elements that make up really effective messaging. And let me just clarify what effective messaging is. To me, effective messaging is when you don't require your audience to think. They just feel that they need you, or they like you, or they need what you're going to sell. And a lot of that is communication on a subconscious level, but it's also understanding that messaging is not a one-off thing. Messaging is not like one email of really good copy, or one ad with really good copy, or heck, it's not even one funnel with really good copy. Messaging and copy are actually two different things. But what I want to talk about is how do we create that really effective messaging? And we're going to talk about three elements that are kind of required. And what really stemmed this conversation is when we have actually been interviewing for some copywriters, some junior copywriters for the team to work on our stuff. And one of the questions I asked them was, what's the difference to you between messaging and copy? And to be honest with you, I didn't really have an answer that I was expecting. I was just curious of what their interpretation was, because I don't think anyone's actually sat down and defined what messaging is, especially in the online business space. I'm willing to bet there's a lot of offline business owners, maybe some of you guys are listening to the podcast, that have no idea what messaging even is. I don't even know what messaging is. What is that? And so I'm just going to give you my definition. I had to really sit down and think about it. But to me, messaging is... It's like an ecosystem. It's this invisible ecosystem. And I think this might be one of the reasons why so many people don't have great messaging and never consider spending time on their messaging, is because it is one of those invisible things. Like when you go to write copy is a tangible thing that you can sit there and you can look at and you can read. You can write copy, you can read copy. Content is one of those things that you can watch, you can consume, you can create, and you're well aware that you're creating content. But messaging is a little bit more invisible. And messaging is kind of a combination of both of those. But here's how I look at messaging. I look at messaging as an ecosystem. And people have to live inside that ecosystem to really understand our messaging. And it's kind of like it's your way of getting your message out, right? Messaging should be your message, but it's deeper than that. It's what evokes desire. It's what grabs eyeballs. It's this thing that the longer people sit inside of, they get to really understand you on a deeper level, understand you, your product, your business, what you stand for, all of that stuff. So that's what messaging is. It's kind of like that ecosystem, this invisible ecosystem of your message. So we have our message, but it's this invisible ecosystem, but it has to do these three things. And the way I look at it is, or the way I like to explain it, is if you looked at a jungle, right? You looked at a jungle, which it's an ecosystem. A jungle could be an ecosystem. If you were to look and just take a tree out of that ecosystem, you plug it, just plant it in your front yard, you would see a tree from the jungle. I don't know, maybe it's a palm tree or whatever. And when we look at copy or a piece of content, a single piece of copy and a single piece of content as our messaging, that would be the equivalent of you saying, hey, look at this tree in my front yard. That's a jungle. And expecting people to really know what a jungle is. It doesn't work like that. But if you took a plant, you took a tree, you took an animal, and you plug those into your front yard, and people experienced it for like 5 minutes, they might have a better idea of what the jungle actually is. So when you have one element, two elements, one video, one piece of copy that are all in alignment, they kind of say the same thing, relatively in the same ballpark. You're kind of saying things differently. Maybe people experience 1, 2, 3 videos. They get a little more of an idea of your message would be, or what your messaging is. Much like if you took more elements from the jungle and plugged them in your front yard, people would have a better idea of what a jungle is. But they still wouldn't know what a jungle is. We need people to enter the jungle, and we need them to stay there to fully understand what a jungle is. All the sounds, all the animals, all the plants, all the insects. What is the air like? How humid is it? And that's what a messaging ecosystem is. That the messaging creates that ecosystem, that the longer people sit inside of your ecosystem, the more they understand that message, the more the desire is created. And there's a couple ways that this needs to happen. Well, before I get into that, this is one of the things you need to understand about messaging, is that it's not about one video. It's not about 3 videos. It's not about one podcast. It's not about 3 podcasts. It's about creating the ecosystem. It's about me saying something on a podcast, and then you go to my Instagram and you see me with a post-it note, taking a picture of it, saying the same thing. And then you, 2 months later, maybe experience a launch where I'm saying a very similar thing. My values are the same. My identities are the same. My thought reversals are the same. I have consistent messaging. But it doesn't matter where you are on the internet, you get to stay inside of my ecosystem. And that's when you fully start to create a massive audience, a loyal audience, people who truly get to know who you are. And I think so many people look at messaging as either a piece of content or even a few pieces of content or a piece of copy or a few pieces of copy, and not an entire ecosystem of your message. So in order for someone to fully understand it, you need to pull them inside the jungle. They need to live inside the jungle. They can't experience a tree in your front yard. They can't experience a tree, a bush, and an animal in your front yard. They need to be pulled into the jungle. So there's 3 things that need to happen. Number 1 is a messaging ecosystem, 3 elements, like element number 1 of a great message, great messaging and a great ecosystem is, number 1, you got to pull people in. You have to pull people into the jungle. If you're in the jungle and you want people to experience the jungle, and maybe you're selling something inside the jungle, you can't do that if people are on outside of the jungle. So number 1, your messaging needs to pull people inside this ecosystem. And there's a couple of ways to do that. We're going to talk about that today. That will actually be the first element. So we're going to talk about 3 of them. But number 2, we need people to stay there. So we have to keep them inside the ecosystem. Again, much like you want someone to fully understand the jungle and maybe want to live in the jungle or buy something from you from the jungle, or let's change up this example a little bit. Let's say you were in the jungle and you wanted to start a community inside the jungle. In order for you to pull people into that ecosystem, number 1, you have to attract them somehow. You have to pull them in. Number 2, you have to keep them there. They have to want to stay there with you. And then number 3, you have to create demand that will want them to grow there with you. So you got to pull them in, you got to keep them, and then you have to create demand for growth. They have to be able to see if you want someone to join the community, you have to show them and paint the picture of them thriving. So when you want them to stay there, they have to like you in order to stay there. They have to like the jungle in order to stay there. They have to like the ecosystem. They have to like the message. They have to like you. But in order to keep them there and wanting to grow, you have to clearly communicate the benefits. And what we're going to do in this episode is we're actually going to dive into all 3 of these. We're going to dive into when we start creating our ecosystem, number 1, what are we going to do to create consistent messaging? But how are we going to pull people, keep people, and create demand? How are we going to get them to grow? So let's talk about that very first one. Let's talk about how to get people to come into the ecosystem in the first place. And there's a lot of ways to do this. Actually, well, there's not a lot. There's 2 that I like using. Number 1 is polarization. And polarization is going to get eyeballs on you. Polarization is going to grab people's attention. It's what's going to pull people in. If someone was walking down a road and there were 15 jungles that they could enter, why would they enter yours? Maybe it's different. Maybe there's an animal that, doesn't exist in the other ones. Or maybe your jungle has red leaves while all the others have green or something like that, right? Your message needs to have some type of polarization to it. Now, this needs to be done in an effective way. We're not going to go out and just say things for the sake of saying things, right? Like if I wanted to get let's pretend I was single for a moment and I wanted to get a girl's attention, I would not just walk up to her and like randomly scream in her face, right? That might get her attention, but she's gonna be like, you're a freak, and walk away. So we have to be strategic about it. And this is what a lot of people will do. A lot of people will hear me say things like, take a stand for what you believe in, but they kind of go about it the wrong way and they start going after their pet peeves. They start complaining and whining about all these things that they don't like. And I say it, I will say it soon. I don't know when this podcast is going to be coming out, but we have a post coming out soon where it says that if your content is you complaining, whining, and bitching, you're going to attract whiners, complainers, and, well, if you have kids in the car, plug their ears, but you're going to attract bitches. And I don't mean that in a really negative way, just complainers, whiners, like people that like to do that type of stuff. But that's the thing. That's the thing that people don't get, is that if you're going to be polarizing, you want to be polarizing against stuff that is actually hurting people. You want to be polarizing against the things that people believe to be true, but is not. It's not true anymore. Much like how I say doing 100% of how-to content is not how to build an audience, and it's why you're stuck. And the thing is most people will do that, and that's what's been taught for a really long time, but it is the one thing that's causing an issue. And sure, I have a lot of pet peeves. I have a lot of things that I would like to just say are wrong, but sometimes those things can actually help people. So for example, I'm very much a believer in high ticket programs. And I not really a fan of like low level, lower ticket programs. It just seems like a lot of work to me, but those things work for people. So I'm not going to go out and talk about how low ticket is this and bad, blah, 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 because I could be misleading people away from something that could actually help them. So if you're going to be being polarizing, you're going to have to identify those industry norms that are a little bit outdated. So for me, I don't really go against how-to content, because how-to content can help people, and there are a lot of people that thrive with it. And in fact, we still do and use how-to content. So I'm not going against how-to content. I'm not taking a stand against how-to content. I'm taking a stand against using content 100% of the time when you're being plateaued. When you're plateaued and no one's listening to you and you're doing how-to content 100% of the time, I'm against that. And almost 100% of the times when someone's in that situation, we get to end the suffering for them and free them from that box. So it's a very small line, and it's a very thin distinction that most people miss. But that's number one, is if you want attention, you have to be polarizing in that manner. Because here's the thing, you guys have to understand is your content will attract people when you're polarizing. So if I did go against, let's just say, for example, I did go against low ticket funnels or low ticket whatever, or self-liquidating whatever, I went against that stuff and I talked negatively about that, you know who I'm going to attract? Only people that agree with high ticket sales. And I teach messaging, and I can teach messaging to a low ticket person and a high ticket person. So why would I automatically just polarize half the audience right away of people that I can actually help? And that's the thing. If you just walk around polarizing like, this is wrong, I don't like this, let's stop this, let's make this a new norm, let's make this normal, and you're going after all of these pet peeves, like 5 or 10 of them, you know what's going to happen? You're eventually going to polarize the entire audience. So if I said and did content of low ticket items are the worst things ever, and then I went against YouTube, and then I went against LinkedIn, and I went against Instagram, I'm eventually just going to polarize the entire market, because polarization and polarizing content can attract the right people if you're careful with it. You want to be going polarizing against things that are causing suffering, because when you start to attract people that are suffering from those things and you get to help them, well, it creates a lot of demand. And that's what I do. That I help people who are suffering from all of that stuff. And those are the people that I want to attract. Polarization will attract. So again, if you're complaining and you're whining, you're going to attract complainers and whiners. If you're polarizing against 10 different random things, there's only going to be a small sliver of people that you can actually serve. So it could be a very dangerous game. But when you're polarizing the right way, you get eyeballs on you. So that's one way to be able to pull people in. The next one is by using connection, identities, and values. I use this example all the time, but if I owned a membership site and I was serving father entrepreneurs, is the example I always use. If I did a piece of content that said father entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs tend to make the best fathers, again, it's not true. It's not a true statement. This is just an example. I would probably attract parent or father entrepreneurs with that piece of content. Then with the message, if the message supported that identity of fathers and entrepreneurs and showed how entrepreneurs have a lot of skills that great fathers have, I would really resonate with that message. Now, that's not polarizing per se, but the intention is to really use identities and values and beliefs that the people I want to come into my ecosystem will have. So again, I'm attracting the right people, and sometimes just plugging identities into headlines, into copies, into emails, into subject lines can allow you to attract exactly who you want. And then if you're polarizing on the right things, it's super easy to be able to attract the right people. I was going to use a metaphor there, but I didn't think of one. So, but it would be like, going fishing with super bait that would catch the right fish every single time. Not only just catch a fish, but catch the right one. Like you wanted a 10-pound trout and you had bait that would only attract 10-pound trouts. That's what it's like. That's what it's like when we are polarizing in the right way, but also building connection in the right way with the right values, the right identities. That's step one. That's the first element we need is to pull people in, but polarizing and connecting. Okay. And sometimes they can go hand in hand. So that's number one. We need to attract, get eyeballs and then once we get the eyeballs, they will enter our ecosystem. They will consume that content. But as you know, we need them to stay inside the ecosystem. We need them to stay because one piece of content, one video is like them seeing the tree and going, wow, that's a cool tree. It has red leaves. I'm going to go check it out. Well, once they go check it out, we need them to stay. So how do we do that? Let's move on to step number 2. How do we keep people inside the ecosystem? There's a lot of ways to do this. So I'm going to try to go through all of them. But number one is we have to give people ahas. We have to be able to explain things in ways that they've never heard before. There has to be something unique about what we're doing. And there's a lot of ways to do this. Number one is if you can constantly give people ahas. And by the way, the ahas do not happen by giving out really great information. Ahas happen by shifting perspective. Knowing where their beliefs are, where their understandings are, knowing the information that they have, and being able to get them to see something different. This is why thought reversals are so important. This is also why someone like Simon Sinek's content is really effective. Because when you hear Simon's TED Talk or you hear him talk about leadership, he gets you to see leadership from a different perspective. He gets you to see it from a different angle. Gary Vaynerchuk grew really fast because he was talking about entrepreneurship in a different light. He was saying things that people wouldn't normally say, but it also made sense. That's the thing here is we need to have it make sense to people. And that doesn't happen by explaining things to people. It happens by using things like metaphors and stories and examples and counterexamples. We're going to talk more about that in step number 3, okay? Because that goes into communication. But that's what we need to do is we need to learn how to shift perspective. Because if people start going, wow, their content is mind-blowing, I've never heard of things like that before. They aren't going to want to go to anyone else. They aren't going to want to leave and go back to another jungle. Like if someone enters the jungle and you had red leaves on your trees and those red leaves were amazing and they were beautiful and they had the option of going back and going to one of the other 20 forests or jungles that all had green leaves, why would they ever do that? Yours is the only one with red leaves and they're beautiful. It blows their mind. They're going to want to stay there. So we have to think about content, again, thought reversals that constantly give them ahas. You have to think about how are you going to communicate certain things that they've never heard before. And part of this is understanding where they're at, understanding the market, understand what's been taught, understand what are they doing because they think it's normal, but is actually causing them pain. This is not your pet peeves. This is things that they really believe to be true. Because to someone who's in a belief, that is their reality. Here's the difference between beliefs and opinions. When someone has an opinion on something, they are well aware that it's their perspective and that there are other perspectives. When someone has a belief on something, it is literally their truth. It is true to them. It is their reality. And if you can poke holes in that reality and show how it's causing suffering, it's boom, mind-blowing because you're shifting their reality. You're making them aware of another perspective they didn't even know existed. And again, this is why we don't want to complain and we don't want to stand on other people's shoulders, because those people will start, like the people that don't agree with that stuff will start to leave. And what we want to do to really keep people inside that ecosystem is to make sure that you have consistent messaging. And the reason why this is so important is because if we're using polarization or we're using identities to pull people into the jungle, pull people into the ecosystem, but then that initial thing that they came in for, we never talk about again, they're going to leave. For example, if they come in and they came in for the red leaves on the jungle, and then they walk in and they realize, oh, the red leaves are only the trees in the jungle to get me to come in, and there's no other red leaves inside this entire jungle, they're going to leave, right? The whole reason why they showed up in the first place is gone. So if you're able to carry consistent messaging, and I tell people all the time, if you're not saying the same thing over and over again, or you're not saying the same thing in different ways, like you should relatively be saying 60 to 70% the same thing in a lot of your content. There's a lot of reasons for that. Number one is consistent messaging, but number two, as your audience grows, they will hear the advice differently because they have a new lens in which they're seeing the world. Someone might hear me say something today, and then if you stay in our ecosystem for the next year, you might hear me say the exact same thing, but you're going to receive it and perceive it differently, interpret it differently because you have a different lens now. So when we want to keep people inside the ecosystem, we got to give them the ahas, we got to shift their perspective, get them to see things in ways they haven't seen it before. We have to keep the message consistent, and we also have to keep the education consistent as well. Sometimes it takes people 5-6 times to hear something to really grasp it or to understand it altogether. So again, let's recap what we have so far. Number one, in order to have really effective messaging, number one, we have to continually pull people in to our ecosystem. And that is done through polarization and connection. Number two, but it has to be the right type of polarization. Number two is once they're there, we want to keep them there. So let's continue the same message that attracted them in the first place. Let's go deeper with it, give them more ahas. Let's thought reversal more things that are causing them suffering. Let's continue to educate them. So ourselves, we need to keep mastering our craft so we can keep elevating and teaching and all of that stuff. And that's what I do. Like if you guys listen to me, 2 years ago and some of the stuff that I teach now, it's different. We're evolving. We're going deeper. I'm continuing to keep people in the ecosystem because I'm evolving what we're teaching, right? Now let's move into my favorite part, which is number 3. Once they're in the ecosystem, how do we create demand? Because it's fine. Like let's just say this. If you stop here, you stop at steps 1 and 2, you get eyeballs on you, you keep them there, you've basically accessed the influencer level, right? You have 1 million fans and they love you and you're not making any money. The next phase is, how do we make the money? How do we turn this into a business? And if we're going back to the example of the jungle, how do we get them to want to build and stay as a part of that community? We want to build a community inside the jungle, which means it's going to require them to stay there, to want to build a hut, maybe start a business, like help build the community. How do we get them to do that? We have to create demand. We got to show the benefits, right? We got to communicate in a way that they understand. Right and proper communication will give you great positioning. And people talk about positioning all the time. How do I position myself in the right place? Talk differently, communicate differently. Do not require people to think. Communicate to the subconscious mind. And that's step number one of this phase, is you have to take subconscious processing into consideration. Right now, when you guys are listening to this podcast episode, and you're here now, you've already formed some kind of decision about this episode. It's interesting. I hope Brandon would get to the point. It's not interesting, whatever. Like you've formed some kind of decision. And if you're still listening, probably it's been educational to you, or mind-blowing to you, or like entertaining, or it's, it's piqued your interest in some way. But it's because I'm communicating to the subconscious mind. And the point is you formed that decision about this episode now without thinking about it. You started to get a feeling. Well, that feeling that you're feeling, that's your subconscious mind making a decision for you without you even realizing it, because you didn't make a conscious decision. You didn't sit there and go, is this a good episode? How do I know it's a good episode? What qualifies it as a good episode? If you had, you'd be making a conscious decision. And you can't do that all day, every day, because it's something, I don't remember the number, but it was something crazy, like 20,000 decisions a day. We don't even think about it. Like, what am I going to wear? What am I going to cook? What am I going to say? All of those things are decisions that you make every single day. You can't possibly make a conscious decision on all of it. So the mind will automate things. The mind will create, hear or receive what's going on. It'll go through your brain, and then you'll get a response or decision without you realizing it. And you're not making these conscious decisions anymore. Now, the reason why this is so important is because your audience does the same exact thing. If we're not creating content that takes that into consideration, you're doing yourself a big disservice. You're not creating demand. So there's a reason why I've been using this jungle example throughout this entire episode. The reason why is because I'm communicating to the subconscious mind. What I'm doing is I'm allowing the subconscious mind to paint a picture of the red leaves, of the green leaves. You notice how I used the red leaves when I talked about consistent messaging. And I said, if you get inside the jungle, they're all green. You're going to go back to all the other jungle. You're going to go out because the reason why you came into the jungle is gone. That allows the subconscious mind to go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Even though messaging may not have anything to do with the jungle, it's a metaphor that makes sense. So the subconscious mind doesn't have to think. I say something and then I use that metaphor, so that the subconscious mind goes, yep, got it, makes sense. You get the head nod effect, like, yes, like, oh my God, that totally makes sense. Sometimes I'll say something and your mind may not even understand what the heck I'm saying. But the second I use a metaphor or an example, boom, it makes sense. When I state something, even in this podcast episode, and I said, here's what Simon Sinek does, the subconscious mind goes, yeah, he does do that. It makes sense. And what that does is it gives the body, your subconscious mind, it gives your whole body, your mind, this feeling of, aha, oh my gosh, makes sense. I didn't require you to think about whether it made sense or not, because I was communicating to the subconscious mind. I was being an effective communicator. And when we are effective communicators, we become someone who creates demand. Yes, thought reversals will create demand, but also when you continue to give people those aha moments over and over and over again, because of your communication style, it becomes a lot more effective. And this is how I make things so easy for people to understand. I can take really complex concepts and make them super simple for people to understand. Now, here's something. I'm going to take this one step further. Some of the things and some of the ways to do this are using stories with lessons in them, using examples, counterexamples, both good and bad, and using metaphors and analogies. Now, there's a lot more ways to do that. Obviously inside our programs, we work heavily with our students on this type of stuff, but I'm going to give you guys 3 right now. Let's talk about counterexamples. If you state something, what you want to do is give an example of that in real life that everyone would know, because you can't argue against that. When I say how-to content's not how to build an audience fast, and I use Gary Vaynerchuk as the example, you can't argue against that. The subconscious mind goes, oh my God, he does. I never thought of that before. This is why I use Gary Vaynerchuk. I use Simon Sinek. I use Mel Robbins. I use Tony Robbins, all his examples, because a lot of them do what I teach. So when I state something and use an example, the subconscious mind goes, oh yes. Now, Simon Sinek is really great at doing this, where he uses an example to back up what he's saying, but he also uses an example of someone who didn't follow his advice and saw a consequence. You can use examples for both. So what Simon Sinek's really good at is he'll say something like, you always need to innovate. Look at Apple, who continued to innovate here with the iPod, with this, with that, and they've seen steady growth over the last 20 years. But then we look at Microsoft, who didn't innovate, who just followed to try to copy what Apple was doing. They weren't innovating, and they saw market share decline this year. So what he was doing in that example is he's using an example to back up what he's saying, but also an example that shows the consequence of not listening to what he just said, which creates a huge amount of demand to want to listen to what he's saying or to want to work with him. And you keep getting those aha moments. Okay, so those are examples. Number one is story. And Dale Carnegie did this really well in his book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, where he just starts the book by telling two stories. And it's the same lesson from both stories. I think there might have people screaming at me at the podcast because I might mess this up. But he told one story, I believe, with Abraham Lincoln, and another one about construction workers not wearing hard hats. And each story, the lesson with each story was that a better leader who gets people to willingly follow them versus having people who follow you just because you're the boss is reinforcing great behavior, rewarding people, praising people, instead of telling people they did a bad job. And he told two stories where that was the lesson, where a boss wanted people to get people to wear hard hats. And option one was to reprimand them and come down on top of them when they didn't wear the hard hat. And number two is he flipped things upside down and praised everyone when they were wearing the hard hats and talked about how he loves how much they care about themselves and safety. And when he did the latter, he willingly got all of the crew to wear their hard hats. Versus the other way, people were only doing it because they were told to do that. And as a leader, you don't want people to do things just because you told them to do it. And both stories had that lesson. And he starts the book off with that. And the reason why this is so powerful is because the subconscious mind goes, oh my God, I didn't think about that. But it makes so much sense. And then he reveals the point. Here's the point I'm making. And here's the theory that I've been operating with, which is when you want to be a good leader, praising people for the behavior that you want, reinforcing people, lifting people up, makes you much more of an effective leader, and it gets people to willingly follow you versus forcing people to follow you. So he gets you to agree with what he's saying on a subconscious level before he even reveals it. So both of those two things work really well. Number one, state what it is and then show the proof with examples to back it up. Number two, use the proof or the stories or whatever first, and those lessons from the story, prove your point, then reveal what the point is. Number two is using metaphors. And the example that I'm going to give for that is just look at this podcast episode, how I've been using the jungle to talk about ecosystems and messaging to make the subconscious mind go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about something I haven't really talked about yet as well. This is a number one mistake that I see people make when it comes to communication. The one thing that I think most people mess up is they don't meet the audience where the audience is at, and they start speaking from where they are at. And I'll give you an example of what I mean with this. When we look at Lord of the Rings and you look at Frodo's journey, and I know our coach Katie is going to be super example, and probably Taylor that I use Lord of the Rings as the example here. So we're going to do a little test to see if they actually listen to the podcast. And if you guys do, let me know that you love this. But anyways, we're going to use the Lord of the Rings example. If we told Frodo, like if we watched all the movies and we know exactly what his journey was going to be and what he was going to have to go through and the decisions that he was going to have to make, and we went back to the very first movie when he had the ring and we said, you have to, here's everything I know exactly what you're going to have to go through. I know all the lessons. I know all the hard times. I know every challenge you're going to have. And I need you to take this ring and go throw it into is it Mordor or the volcano thing or the eye or whatever it is. You need to go do all that. And here's the things you're going to face in that journey. Trust me, you're going to face all this stuff. It's going to give you amazing growth and you're going to really love it, but you're going to have to face all of this stuff. Do you think that he's going to go through with it? Probably not. But if we met him where he's at and we said, hey, you got to bring this ring to Mordor or wherever it is, I might be messing it up, and you got to go drop the ring in. And I stopped there and I waited for his response and I met him where he was at, I'm going to have a much better chance of him doing it. So he might say something like, well, I don't have enough time right now. Well, great. Let me create a thought reversal video and take care of this time objection that you have. I'm meeting him where he is. And once I kind of communicate from where he is, then he gets to go take the action. And when we talk about messaging, and when I talk about messaging and we look at our funnels and our launches, I keep one cohesive, consistent theme through an entire funnel. And the reason why I do that is because I don't want to do too much too soon. I don't want to tell people you're going to have to figure out all your values and you're going to have to figure out this pattern, you're going to have to do this and Facebook, all this stuff. I'm going to meet them where they're at, which is, here's what I know you believe. Here's what I know you think is true. Here's where you're causing suffering. I'm going to thought reversal those things. And I'm going to give you one easy solution that you can use right now, which is figuring out thought reversals, connection, and what to do. Very simple. That's all we're going to focus on. And that's all I do inside of our launches. And you can attend to any one of our launches and you'll see it's one cohesive, consistent theme. But it is not everything that I do. When people go into the Video 4X program and they see our sales page, there is so much more on there than what I talked about inside of our entire launch. I don't just word vomit all over everyone, slam them with all this information. I don't try to sell them by telling them how many modules and videos there's going to be. I'm focusing on meeting them where they're at, removing objections, shifting their reality, and providing a little bit of what to do to start fixing those problems. And because I do that, I'm shifting the reality, I'm changing the perspective, I'm communicating in ways that they've never heard before. And that's step number 3. This is how you start to create demand. Speak to the subconscious mind. Understand where they're at. Where is their thinking at? What have they realized so far? What have they not realized so far? And continue doing that. And then when you do that, it starts to create demand. That's what keeps people in the community. It's what keeps people wanting to work with you. So hopefully that all makes sense. So just to recap, the 3 powerful elements that make up super effective messaging are number 1, well, first of all, we have to understand that messaging is an ecosystem and people need to stay inside that ecosystem to fully experience messaging. It's not one video, it's not 2 videos, not 3 videos or 1 podcast or 1 ad or 1 email. It's an ecosystem that's consistent. So we need 3 things. Number 1, we need to pull them into that ecosystem. And we do this with connection and polarizing content, but be strategic with it. Remember, it's an attraction tool. It's not therapy where you get to express your pet peeves of everything that bugs you about your niche and your industry. Be strategic about it. Be smart. One of my mentors always said, the fish that gets caught is the one who opens his mouth. So sometimes there's a lot of people out there creating content and they're opening their mouth when they shouldn't be. And they're going to get caught. You're going to get caught because you're only going to start attracting those people. And I'm telling you right now, it can take down your business. It really can. So be strategic with the polarizing and the connection content. But that is what will grab attention. Notice how I didn't say educational how-to content. It's how we pull people in. Because again, if we did, that's like having a green leaf jungle with 20 other green leaf jungles all around us. You're saying the same thing as everyone else. Number 2, we have to keep people there, continually giving them ahas look at our craft as mastery, let the evolution of things that we're teaching take place, reinforcing their values and their identity. Again, this is why complaining and whining doesn't work. And have really a message, a cohesive, consistent message. The thing that pulled them in should be the thing that keeps them there. Keep that in mind. And then number 3, we have to want them to grow within that ecosystem. And that happens through powerful communication, which is you communicating in the way the subconscious mind is working. Okay. And we can do that through stories, metaphors, examples, stuff like that. Again, we have a lot more of that inside of our programs that we help people with. But what I would love to hear from you is, what is your biggest aha? Let me know inside of our New Generation Entrepreneur podcast group, which we are growing. We're going to be building a community there. I'm going to start doing, I'm not sure when, but we're going to start doing relatively soon talks, or not talks, but I guess little coaching sessions on Fridays inside that group, where you as the community member can come on and ask me questions. Maybe I'll do some insider training or talk further about the episode of that week. So head over to that group, the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. And if you have not left us a review, I'd be so grateful for one, especially if it's a 5-star review. The more reviews that we get, the more traction we get, the more people we can help. And I just want to hear from you. Let me know how you're enjoying the podcast. And if you're enjoying it, go ahead and leave us a 5-star review. And I appreciate that. So take care, guys. We'll see you on the next episode. Hey, guys, thank you so much for checking out another episode of the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, go below, hit the subscribe button, and make sure you click on that bell icon and get notified every time we drop a new episode. Now, if you're looking for the show notes, we have them linked underneath this video, as well as our social media handles and some links to free training and offers that we drop from time to time to help you guys even further. So go check those out if you're interested. And thank you so much for tuning in to the New Generation Entrepreneur Podcast.